Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a truly profound manifesto from 1938 called The Advent of Divine Justice. It was penned by Shoghi Effendi, the head of the Baha'i Faith at the time, and it laid out this absolutely monumental mission for the North American community. Picture the historical context here. The world is literally teetering on the precipice of the Second World War. And right in the middle of that creeping darkness, this document drops as both a deeply spiritual and highly strategic survival guide for a relatively small group of believers. So let's kick things off by asking the core question at the heart of all this. How on earth could a small, largely inexperienced group be tasked with ushering in a completely new world order amidst total global chaos? I mean, we're talking about a community separated by oceans from the birthplace of their faith, generally lacking any massive material wealth, and completely unfamiliar with the native languages of their spiritual founders. Yet they were handed this daunting, continent-spanning mission. How could they possibly pull that off? To answer that, we're going to follow a clear roadmap today. We'll start with a world in turmoil, then move into America's spiritual destiny, explore the 3 spiritual weapons, tackle eradicating racial prejudice, and finally look at the 7-year plan.
All right, Section 1, A World in Turmoil. The text paints a really stark historical contrast here. Think about what was happening globally. While sister communities in Europe and Asia were facing intense suppression, property expropriation, and fratricidal strife, the North American community was sitting there as the sole free citadel of the faith. Shoghi Effendi maps out this terrifying reality where institutions in Central Europe were being dissolved by restrictive regimes, temples in Central Asia were literally being seized, and the very cradle of the faith was dealing with massive repression from corrupt clergy. Amidst all that global fracturing, the North American community stood uniquely free. And because of that freedom, they carried an unparalleled responsibility to keep the torch burning.
Because you see, this wasn't just a political crisis. To them, it was a spiritual battle. A literal chill of a religion was creeping relentlessly over humanity. The text describes a world that is heaving with blind nationalism, scorched by racial and religious persecution, and just disintegrating through moral decadence. In the author's view, humanity was falling victim to its own contending passions. So the need for a redemptive, unifying force wasn't just important, it was absolutely urgent.
Which brings us to Section 2, America's Spiritual Destiny.
The scale of the destiny outlined here is honestly breathtaking. It officially designates America as the incubator for a future world civilization. The text cites Abdu'l-Baha, one of the central figures of the faith, stating that America is the land where the mysteries of the faith shall be unveiled, where the righteous will abide and the free will assemble. It essentially frames the North American community as the torchbearers of a new light, tasked with eventually building the actual framework for global peace and order.
But here is the massive twist, and it's probably my favorite part of the whole text. They weren't chosen because they were perfect. In fact, it was the exact opposite. They were selected precisely because their society was so plagued by materialism and corruption. It was a way of proving that the divine can transmute the deepest darkness into light. Shoghi Effendi issues a very firm warning here. He explicitly states that the American nation wasn't chosen due to any innate racial superiority or special political aptitude. No, because the nation suffered from a binding materialism, virulent racial prejudice, and moral laxity. They were the ultimate testing ground. By transforming a people from within such a deeply flawed society, the faith could definitively prove its redemptive, world-changing power to a totally skeptical world.
Okay, moving right along to Section 3, 3 spiritual weapons. Now, before this community could even think about reforming the world, they had to radically reform themselves. They were commanded to wield 3 specific spiritual weapons against the long-standing evils of their nation. The text makes it crystal clear. No grand administrative plan, no financial scheme, nothing would succeed without these 3 imponderable spiritual prerequisites. So let's look a bit closer at the first 2. The first weapon is rectitude of conduct. This demands absolute, uncompromising justice and honesty, especially from administrators. It was meant to offer a striking contrast to the utter deceitfulness that characterized the political life of that era. This implies total truthfulness, fair-mindedness, and trustworthiness in all business and domestic dealings, and it strictly mandates non-participation in political controversies or partisan politics. The text actually uses this beautiful imagery, noting that a true servant of God would pass through cities of silver and gold without even deigning to look upon them. It's an awe-inspiring call for pure, unshakable integrity in a highly corrupt age.
The second weapon is a chaste and holy life, and this one relies heavily on the youth. They were asked to maintain purity and moderation, completely rejecting the frivolous and damaging moral laxity of a heavily materialistic society. This meant daily vigilance over carnal desires and total abstinence from alcoholic drinks and habit-forming drugs. But, and this is a crucial caveat, the text carefully notes that this is not a call to asceticism or some kind of bigoted Puritanism. Individuals are entirely free to enjoy the legitimate joys and beauties of life as long as they practice moderation and avoid the toxic excesses of a decadent age.
Now for Section 4, Eradicating Racial Prejudice.
The Baha'i ideal tackles this through a truly beautiful metaphor. It asks us to imagine humanity as a single garden, where diverse colors and shapes don't clash, but rather they only add to the perfect chord of unity. Shoghi Effendi identifies racial prejudice as a corrosion that had bitten deep into the fiber of American society for a century. So in total defiance of that prejudice, the text elevates the fellowship of different races to a literal divine mandate. It explains that God looks at the purity of the heart, completely and entirely disregarding the color of the exterior. But this transformation requires a massive mutual effort. White individuals must actively dismantle their subconscious superiority, while Black individuals must bravely wipe out lingering suspicions to forge genuine fellowship. The text demands that white believers completely abandon any patronizing attitude and prove the genuine sincerity of their friendship. Conversely, Black believers, or as identified in the text, Negro believers, are urged to show a warm response and wipe away the very understandable suspicions left by slow-healing historical wounds. Neither side can just sit back and wait for the other to take the initiative. It requires extreme patience and consummate tact from absolutely everyone involved.
And I find this next point absolutely fascinating. The text actually dictates that if an election is tied, priority must unhesitatingly be given to the minority representative to actively nurture and safeguard them. Remember, this is the 1930s. In a world where minorities were routinely trampled upon or completely ignored, this was a radically progressive administrative principle. It explicitly asserts that every community must make it their very first obligation to nurture minorities. By actively engineering their institutions to force diverse representation, they aim to demonstrate the true universality of their faith to the world at large. Let's move into our final section, Section 5, the 7-year plan. So all those spiritual weapons, they were ultimately preparation for this, the 7-year plan. And it was highly structured, moving from domestic consolidation all the way to an intercontinental global spread. Step 1 was strictly internal. Finish the exterior ornamentation of their majestic house of worship and plant at least one group in every single U.S. state and Canadian province. Only after establishing that rock-solid domestic foundation would they launch down into Latin America and eventually propagate across Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australasia. 20. Think about that number for a second. That is the number of independent Latin American nations the believers were tasked to reach. This required immense dedication and totally self-supporting pioneer teachers. At the time, these 20 republics made up about 1/3 of the world's sovereign states. So reaching them wasn't just a matter of dropping a letter in the mail. It required individuals to pack up, flee their native towns, forsake all their comforts, and travel vast distances to entirely virgin territories, totally on their own initiative.
And the logistics behind this were just staggering. Imagine having to translate sacred texts into Spanish and various other languages, dispatch those self-supporting pioneers into the unknown, and lovingly engage indigenous populations like the Indians and Eskimos. And the kicker? They had to do all of this while completely avoiding any pressure or proselytizing. Pioneers were expected to just mix in a friendly manner with all sections of the population. The text highlights the immense spiritual potential of native populations, predicting that if they were properly educated, they would shed illumination upon the entire world. The core instruction was simple but difficult. Share your beliefs only with utmost kindness and absolute respect for the listener's free will.
Now, the text fully acknowledges how terrifying it must be to travel to an unfamiliar continent completely alone. But it offers this profound assurance that even a single individual acting with pure intent would be backed by divine hosts. The text continually reassures these pioneers that the power of their message doesn't rely on their personal wealth or high education. If they detach themselves from the world and speak with genuine love, invisible hosts will aid them, making even an isolated atom function as a sun. It's an incredibly empowering promise. To wrap up our explainer today, I want to leave you with a final thought.
Having just explored these formidable spiritual weapons, how can you apply them in your own life to help build a better world right now? Because let's be honest, the challenges of moral decay, deeply ingrained prejudice, and social turmoil are just as relevant today as they were back in 1938. Can the principles of absolute justice, true inner purity, and radical unifying fellowship provide a roadmap for us today? I really hope this deep dive into the source material has sparked your curiosity. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep exploring.